Hi everybody, I'm Tom Dyson and I'm here to talk to you about alternative approaches for hosting your Django projects. Let me share my screen. Great. So I'm from Torchbox. We're an agency in the UK. We've been using Django for almost since the beginning, pretty much since the beginning. We also the agency behind Wagtail, the open source content management system that I hope many of you are familiar with. But I'm not talking about Wagtail today. I would encourage some of you to, or any of you to follow along with this talk using the link here, tomd.org/deploy. Most of this talk is going to be a live demo, and the steps that I'm going to be going through are exactly the same ones on those notes, and it may be helpful for you to go along with those. You'll just need a few things in order to complete all the steps. The most important one is a computer with Python on it, which I would guess most of you have. And then it would be useful to have a GitHub account, some sort of disposable Linux virtual machine. And I've put some links in these notes with a couple of sites that have credit, $100 credit to get you started if you don't have one already, and a Google account. So the purpose of this talk is to kind of address this question that I see a lot in Django support forums. We see it a lot, in fact, in the Wagtail support forums as well, but I think it's more particularly around Django generally. And it's people who've gone through the Django tutorial, who've worked out how to build a site, and then they get stuck and then the next step is making it live, and they get stuck there. And you see a lot of people making asking for help like this, and they often kind of apologize, which I think is a shame, because they shouldn't have to apologize for this. The skills for deploying sites are pretty different to the skills to create sites. And I feel like I really like this last point here, where someone replies to somebody else who's been struggling, where they say, it's good to know I'm not the only one going to keep on struggling till I don't realize it's a struggle. And it's funny and it's nicely written, but it was also, I think it's a shame, because I think it's true for those of us who have deployed Django sites using Nginx or Apache and Unicorn Supervisor, or worked out how to use Heroku or these other systems. Then if you do it enough times, then it's hard to remember how much of a mountain it is to climb for people who have just learned Django and are suddenly presented with all these options. And I should be clear that there are lots of fantastic options for deploying sites as you become more familiar with it. So there's the do-it-yourself approach, like the one I described, where you have your own Linux servers and you install Nginx and Unicorn or USG and so on. And then there are kind of great platforms like Divio, where a lot of this, and they provide 24/7 support, and a lot of this is handled for you. So but what I want to talk about today is the three options that are not so well known, and that I think could be really a good, useful starting point for people who have just built their first Django site and want to find quickest ways of making it live. The first one is called Doku, and a way you could think about Doku is like a really simple open source Heroku. So it's actually a long bash script that manages Docker containers on a Linux server, but you don't really need to know how it works. You just need to know the 2 lines to install it, and then how to push your site to it to make it live. The second one is static site generation. And this feels a bit like Back to the Future. When I was first building websites in the late 90s, I would handcraft HTML files and FTP them to a shared server somewhere. And this is kind of it feels a bit like going back to that, because you're building sites out of static HTML pages, but with a very different tooling approach. And there turned out to be quite a lot of benefits to this, which I'll go through towards the end. And the last one is a relatively new product from Google called Cloud Run, which is like you take your Docker containers, and as they say in their marketing somewhere, they convert containers into URLs. And there are a few rough edges around this, but I think the model, this kind of serverless model of serverless containers, that sounds like really jargony, but I think this serverless model is a really interesting one, and I predict it's going to become the standard way of deploying applications. So it's interesting to see how that's working now. All right. The most part of this talk is going to be a live demo, and I'm going to try and do a lot of these steps in the time that we've got available. It's going to be a bit of a race against time. So you'll have to forgive me if it doesn't go perfectly and we don't get through everything. And I hope some of you will be able to follow along too, using that link tomd.org/deploy, which will take you to here. So we are going to start. We have some of these things by building a Wagtail site locally. And I've used Wagtail here. This can be any Django app. Wagtail is just a kind of is an example of a fully featured Django app that's quite quick to install. So that's why I've used it here. But none of this is specific to Wagtail. So in my local environment here, I would create environment and install Wagtail. I've done those first 3 steps, so you don't have to watch that scrolling past. But I'm now going to start a new Wagtail site and go into that directory. And the next thing I'm going to do is install a package that actually I wrote about a month or so ago called Wagtail Fake News, which is a way to create a lot of dummy content in your site. I did it really for testing, particularly for testing volume, so see how well it kind of scales when you have more volume. So we add that and put it in our requirements.txt, and then we're going to add it to our installed apps in settings. So of course, there are more elegant ways of doing this, but I'm just going to push that line to the bottom of my settings file. And the next step is to run and migrate. So this is common again. This is a standard thing that as a Django developer, you'll be used to. So creating all the tables that Django needs, and then that Wagtail needs, and that Wagtail Fake News needs. That's all done. And now we have this new management command. I didn't copy that correctly. Make fake items. So this is the one that comes from Wagtail Fake News, and this is going to create 50 fake news pages each, and 50 images, and it's going to associate images with each one. That happens pretty quickly, 7 seconds. And one last little step, Wagtail has a default home page, which we don't want, so we're just going to overwrite that template quickly with that line, and then we're going to run the server. So most of this now is hopefully feeling quite familiar for Django sites. So now I'm running my server, and let's see how that's worked. So in a new browser tab, I am checking here that this news is linked, and I just want to check something actually in the Slack to make sure that I'm not seeing anything in the Slack. I'm just hoping my screen share is working. I guess otherwise someone would have told me, but I'm just not seeing the screen share indication over my screen. Right, so now we are seeing, can someone just like give me a positive sign in the general channel on Slack, just to say that you can see my screen? Working fine, thank you, Darren Jones. A little moment of panic there. Okay, so we can see now that this my site is running, and that's great. So that's like, I don't know, how far are we in now? 5 minutes, and we've got our local Django site running. That's basically, you know, just credit to Django for making that site really easy. The next step now we're getting on to deploying. So now we are going to install Doku on a Linux server. And I would generally use one of a service like DigitalOcean or Volta. And so I would create something like, let me see if that's going to log me in. Create a new server on Volta or DigitalOcean, one of these services. So go here and Cloud Compute, and then I can choose my location. I always feel like servers in Paris are a little bit more stylish than anywhere else. And then get the latest Debian. The small one is fine as long as you've got about 1 GB of memory, and add your SSH key to it, and probably give it a name and hit deploy now. I'm not going to do deploy now because I've already done one, and it just takes a couple of seconds, but you might have done something a bit like that as I was talking. So here is the server I've created, and then I'm going to log into that one. So here in this tab with a black background, I've logged into that server. And the next thing to do would be to install Doku, which is these 2 lines. So it gets the bootstrap.sh and then runs it. I've done that already. It takes about 2 minutes, so you didn't need to see that running up my screen. Once that's done, then you go to your server's IP address in a browser. So if I get the IP address here, and make a new tab and go to the browser. That loads this initial Doku page. So Doku doesn't have a web interface generally, apart from this initial screen where you just check, you can provide your SSH key and give it a host name. I'm just going to use the same IP address and tell it to start. That's done, and then it's just going to redirect me away to the Doku docs, which I don't need, so I'm going to close that tab. Okay, so Doku's installed. The next thing I need to do is create an app on the server. So if you use Heroku, this will seem pretty familiar. This a lot of the commands are quite similar to, you could say they've been inspired by Heroku. So we've created the app, and now we're going to install the Doku Postgres plugin. So Doku has a concept of plugins, and most of them, I think they probably all are themselves Docker containers. Again, you don't really need to know that, but they're ways of providing different services on your Doku instance. So Postgres one is probably one of the most popular ones. And that means that we now have Postgres 11.6 running on our Doku instance. Once that has finished, which shouldn't take much longer, we can create our first database. So we now get this Postgres create command that didn't exist before because we've installed the plugin. So that's going to create a database called demo-db, which will take a second. And then we're going to link that demo-db to our new app. So we created an app called demo app, and we're going to link the database to it. And again, this is a bit like how Heroku works, where you make these variables like the database URL available to your apps. Okay, so that's all done. Something worth knowing about Doku, and in fact lots of these kind of modern services, and Heroku is similar, anything where you're using Docker generally, is that they are ephemeral. That means that every time you deploy them, they're recreated from scratch, which feels a bit weird when you're used to it, but it turns out to be a good thing, and it helps you design your application in I think in a correct way. So it follows this set of principles called the 12-factor design, which you may have come across. I recommend looking about. But it means that if you, for example, if your app has user content, you have a content management system and you're uploading images, then they're going to be lost every time you redeploy, which is no good. So we need to have some sort of persistent storage. So one approach might be use something like S3, but Doku has an option for this as well. So you will create a directory, and then we're going to mount it inside Doku, giving it the name, and we're going to make that available as a variable called media route, which our application is going to need to listen to on. Right, our application that we've built so far, so this is going back into the white tab where we built our application. Because it's like a Django app, doesn't use Postgres by default. So we need to make sure the Postgres is installed and that it's in our requirements.txt. And then we need to tell our app using settings to use these variables that are now available. So we now have this database URL and media route available. So I'm going to add those, just plonk them at the bottom of the file, which isn't really best practice, but it's fine for now. Okay, so we now have our app and we have installed Doku. Now we're going to do our first deploy. So deployments in Doku are all about Git. So we're going to create our Git repository, add everything to it, first commit, and then we're going to make a new remote. And so I need to put in the IP address of our server, which should be somewhere in my clipboard history. There we go. And adding a new remote called Doku. And then the final step is to git push to Doku. This is the bit that's going to take a minute or two. And while that's happening, I can just kind of recap a bit on what we've got to so far. And I've got actually some slides to kind of help us think about this. So we made a simple Django site. We installed Doku on a VM using those two lines. We enabled Postgres in that Doku instance. We added persistent storage. And we just ran git push to deploy. So the making a simple Django site is what you do normally. Installing Doku and the Postgres things are one time only. After that, and the persistent storage is probably for each app, and then the git push to deploy is what you do for your apps afterwards. So we can see what's happening now. We push that up to Doku, and Doku immediately saw the Docker file that existed in our app, and so understood what to do with it. So it's following the instructions in the Docker file. It's currently now installing all the contents of requirements.txt. So all those things are going to be available to our app. It will link up the Postgres database, hopefully, and make that available to our app. And once it's happy that everything's there, it will deploy it. And one of the things that Doku does is check that everything's working before it deploys it live, which is really a kind of valuable step, but it does slightly slow things down, and you can do it in a more intelligent way if you like by creating your own custom checks. This isn't the most interesting part. While it's just waiting to see what the installation part is. But now it's doing the deployment. So these steps will look familiar to anyone who's done Docker before. And maybe this is just, while this takes another 30 seconds, I could just start talking a bit about Docker, which is, we don't have time in this talk to kind of go into information on, to kind of full background on Docker. But Docker is a way of packaging up your applications like a very lightweight virtual machine, and it's increasingly becoming a standard for deploying your applications across lots of different systems. And it's also can be useful for local development. So when you create a Wagtail site, it creates a simple Docker file for you. But there are other ways of doing that. So if you have a Django app, if you followed, for example, one of the cookie cutter steps, then the Django cookie cutter, then you'll also get a Docker file. So that's now finished, and it's telling us that our application is deployed on a live server, and we hold our breaths, type it in, and it's live. So we've built our site. We have installed Doku. We have deployed a site to Doku, and it's now live. However, there are no news items on it because we haven't created any content on that one yet. So we're going to need to run a couple of tasks, and this is back on the server. We're going to run a management task, and you can see the syntax for this is pretty much like the normal manage.py, but you start it with Doku run, and then you specify the name of the app. It takes a few seconds longer than a normal management task because it has to spin up a container quickly in order to make that available. And then similarly, we're going to create some fake items just like we did before, but this time we're running it on Doku. So again, a few seconds for it to spin up the container, and then it starts creating all those fake items. So now if we look again on that one, but on our live server, and go to fake index, we see all our site and all the pages that have been created. And just to confirm that the admin user worked, I can hopefully log in now using the details I just created, and browse through Wagtail, and let's edit a page. Maybe this first one, box last resource. Let's check this is working. Exclamation mark. We'll change that image to audience democratic modern, and bolden some of that and preview it. And that all looks good. I must say, I find these randomly generated content really intriguing, and it makes me think. Sometimes it kind of sound really weirdly profound. Never direction what, price might sell, rate really positive. Sometimes feel like who needs artificial intelligence when randomness is this good? Okay, so to recap on where we've got to. We have git push to deploy. We now have a live site, production ready, running on our $5 instance. This could handle probably 5 or 6 reasonable sized Django apps for $5 a month, and you git push to deploy, and it's a pretty quick process so far. Okay, next up is static site generation. There are quite a few ways of generating a static version of your site. The one I'm going to use is based on Django Bakery, which was open sourced by the LA Times. In fact, we're going to use Wagtail Bakery, which is just a sort of bit of a wrapper around Django Bakery that does some more convenient things for Wagtail sites. So install that, add it to our requirements.txt, and then make a few changes to our settings again. Demo settings base.py. Add it to the bottom. So we're adding bakery and Wagtail Bakery. We're telling it to build out to temp/dist, and we're saying that we want all our published pages. Those are going to be the pages that we want to be live. And this gives us a new management command, build. And build will take that view and create published versions of all those pages. Usually takes about 5 or 6, so in this that can sit 9 seconds. And so if I now check in my, where do we say, temp/dist, there we can see it's created some pages, and we can see for each of those pages it's created a directory and a page inside it. So we now have static content for all those pages, which is great, but it's just running on our laptop, still on a development environment. So now we need to publish that. For that, I'm going to use Netlify. There are lots of other ways we could do this, but Netlify has a lot of benefits. So it's an excellent service, and you can install the command line version like this. I've done that already, but you can do that. It'll just take you a couple of minutes. And what am I now? I'm going to go into that directory. So this is the one with all the statically generated content, and I'm going to run Netlify init. So the first time you do this, you'll probably need to authenticate, and you can do that against your GitHub credentials. I've done it already, so I can just go ahead like this, choose my team. Hello, DjangoCon EU. Hope no one has used that before. Yes, so that site has now been created, but now I need to deploy. So the first one was just creating the site. I'm going to do from this current directory. It's going to check and see if there any files exist up there already, and they don't because it's the first time we've done it. And then it's going to push all those files up. And once that's done, it is hopefully going to deploy them. And this is normally super quick, waiting for deploy to go live. Just while that's going, I'll show you what the UI looks like in Netlify on the web UI. So here I'm now seeing the manual deploy. So that's now being created. The site's not being deployed, as we know. This is sort of hanging at that last minute. So I'm going to do the classic, turn it off and turn it on again, stop it and start again. This time I'm going to do prod, which is going to make it go live straight away. That's usually a separate step, but this time I'm just going to do it in one go. This time we're getting some nice emojis that we didn't get last time, which is a bit odd. And this step, once it goes live, should give us a static version of the site hosted on Netlify, which has its own collection of CDNs and works across clouds and has a lot of other interesting features, particularly around things like serverless functions and authentication and so on, which we're not going to go into in this talk. I'm hoping that's going to finish in a minute and I can do a big kind of celebratory ta-da. If it doesn't, I'm going to have to wait and go back to a previous one to show that it is working. So this is one I did just slightly before, and click on it here, and you can see now this is running on netlify.app, and all these pages are available. So the content of our Django site, the output of our Django site, is now running on Netlify. You can see on netlify.app. Netlify knows nothing about Django or Python or databases. It's hosting the static pages, but it's doing them in a very efficient way, and also, interestingly, a very cheap way. That one hasn't gone live, so it's lucky I had that back up for me. Hopefully it will do before the end of my talk, so you'll believe me. Okay, so where have we got to? Live demo 2, we generated our static pages. We used Django Bakery, but there's a few other approaches we could have used too. We installed Netlify, and we deployed to Netlify. And great, next one, then the final one of this demo is using Google Cloud. So like I said before, this is a new product, newish product, recently come out of beta from Google, called Cloud Run. And you have to start by installing the Google Cloud SDK, which I have already, but you could do, doesn't take too long. Cancel that one now so we can go through this. And then you have to create, so Google Cloud has this concept of projects. So you can kind of group all your stuff together in different projects. So this is what it looks like in the console. Here, I've created a project called Deploy Talk, which has that ID. So I need to tell Google Cloud the name of my project. And then you have to enable the minimum APIs, which I've done already. That says what bits of Google Cloud we want to use. You have to set your project ID and region. That's going to be useful for some shell scripts later. And this approach is going to be a little bit similar to the Doku one, where we get a Docker image and we submit it. So now from our app, there's two key steps with this. The first, most of it is kind of boilerplate really. This is the first key step where we're going to take our current app. Actually, we're not going to do this now because I'm in the wrong place. I need to go back to my demo app. And we're going to take this current directory and submit a build for it. So it's going to create a Docker image based on the contents of my directory, which apparently I've got about 19 gigabytes in total. And it's going to push all that up to Google Cloud's image storage and make it available for other services to use. We had this first step called use Canico, which is quite a recent feature. It's a sort of strange name, but it basically enables caching of your build step. So you can see in some of the lines coming up here that this build is quicker than it would have been otherwise, because I've done it once before, and everything that hasn't changed in my app can just be reused from the cached layers. So having done all that and run manage.py, it's creating that, adding all this to the cache, and it's going to put the whole image, make the whole image available for us to deploy. There we go, done. Took 48 seconds. So it's created this image, and the final step is to deploy that image. So I'm going to paste this in and run it, and then I'm going to tell you what it means. So we are saying gcloud is the general term, run is because this is about Google Cloud Run, the action is deploy, and demo app cloud run is the name of the service that we want to deploy. And it's going to deploy a service from this image, which is the one that we just uploaded before. So we created an image for demo app image, and we're now deploying it. And this should be fairly quick because Google Run service just needs to fetch that image from locally from elsewhere in the Google Cloud and create a revision for it. And that is now done. So, and it, a bit like Netlify, it assigns you a new URL and paste that in and hit enter. And then one thing you'll notice here is that this is slow. And this is because of one of the issues with serverlessness generally is this so-called cold starts. And cold starts are because in this case, when the first time we request the app, it has to start that container. And this container is a rather inefficient container because the way that the Docker file works that you get out of the box in Wagtail, it runs a migration to make sure that your database is up to date, which you really don't want to run all your migrations the first time anyone requests your site. Of course, and there's a lot you can do to optimize that. So that's not kind of best practice for production Docker files, and actually you should move that step out of your Docker file, which and there's lots of good documentation on how to do that. Once it is up and running, then Google Cloud does a really good job of preventing cold starts afterwards. But for that first one, you want to find ways of reducing that cold start. So we now have that same app running in, I think, 3 different places. We have it on Doku, we have it on Netlify, and we have it on Cloud Run. Let me just quickly show you how that looks on Cloud Run in their UI. This is a couple of interesting things about the setup here. Also, I find that this UI quite slow sometimes. It'd be a shame if that doesn't come up quickly. While that's going, I'm just going to recap on what we've done. We installed the gcloud CLI that made this possible. We built an image and we pushed it up to Google Cloud Storage, and then we deployed it to Google Cloud Run. This is still loading. Sometimes you just give it a little tweak. The thing I wanted to show you here is how you can configure the scaling of your instances, which I think is the really interesting thing about Google Cloud Run, is the way that it scales not just upwards. So you can scale to 1,000 by default. It's 1,000 instances of your container, each one of which by default can handle 80 concurrent requests. But also it scales to 0. So here's the revision I just created. For my next one, I could set some other variables like how much memory. So this is currently running on a tiny amount of memory, so I'd probably want more like half a gig. And I could change the number of CPUs. And I could say how many requests I have. But this is, I think, the really interesting part. So this will currently scale up to 1,000 instances if you need them without you having to do anything. Just as your traffic increases, it will create new instances when it needs them. But also it will scale down to 0. And I gave a talk about serverlessness in Florence, I think 3 years ago, was it 2 or 3 years ago? And I talked about this idea of turning the lights off when you leave the room, which I think is one of the most interesting aspects of serverlessness, that when people aren't on your site, it's kind of not financial or ecological sense to keep that server running. And that's what I like about this sort of serverless approach, is that you are only paying when people are hitting your site in this, and the servers are even only alive when you're hitting them. So I think scaling to 0 is a kind of really interesting component of all this. All right, I want to talk in the last remaining minutes, very briefly about the pros and cons of these different approaches. So Doku, I think this is the easiest way of getting your site into production. So we did it, I think, in under 10 minutes. This is a standard Django site. You can go live in 10 minutes if you have a Linux box available, a $5 Linux box. It also encourages good coding practices. So that 12-factor design I talked about before, and it's super cheap. You can run a few Django sites for $5 a month, and these are like, that you can do this in production, and we've done this successfully at Torchbox. On the other hand, Doku doesn't have horizontal scaling, so if you need more instances, you can't have lots of Doku instances next to each other. And in a similar way, there's no redundancy. If the hard disk dies on your machine, then all your sites will go. The infrastructure is on you. Static site generation, the pros are pretty convincing. It's the cheapest way to host your site. You cannot be faster than a static site, and you cannot hack a static site. So it's pretty compelling for all these reasons. On the other hand, you get this build time delay. So if you have a really big site and you have to generate a static version each time, then there can be a pause between making the content and having it live. There are more moving parts because you need a Django server and a static site server like Netlify, and it may not suit your app. So it works well for kind of static, like a content manager type sites. But if you need personalization or you have logins or lots of forms, then it's probably not going to be the approach for you. On the Google Run side, it scales forever, not quite forever, but if you need more than 1,000 instances handling 80 concurrent users each, then you've got bigger problems. It scales to 0, as I mentioned before. I think that's really important, and it's the future. That's a bit glib, but I do think this model is the way that that app hosting is going to go. On the other hand, you have to deal with cold starts. It's still complicated. So I showed you the easy parts, but once you get into connecting databases and persistent storage, there's some more complicated instructions, which I've linked to at the bottom of my notes. And finally, databases are not serverless. So there are some sort of serverless database products, and Aurora on AWS serverless is one, but it's not. I think it's just really hard for a relational database to be available as a serverless model. So it's currently still feels a bit hybrid, but I do think that this is the way that increasingly apps will be hosted. Okay, if you need to deploy as quickly as possible, then I think Doku is a good approach. If your site is mainly about information, then static site generation gives you that speed and robustness, and it's super cheap. If you have to scale, then I think a Cloud Run type approach is the way to go. That is it. I'm sorry for going on so long, and I'm going to stop now, but I'm really happy to answer questions either on Slack or in the Q&A section afterwards. Thank you all very much.